What is identity? Identity, it's that what we identify with. Kind of simple, straightforward, isn't it? What would be one's identity? What would one's identity be comprised of, made of? No, just don't take it for granted. The term identity is being used very wide, in wide use in spiritual circles. Going way back, and even in the New Age, from the teachers likes of Eckhart Tolle to Pleiad and myriad of other teachers, the identity, that the calamity comes from identifying with this temporal so-and-so, that individual that one considers oneself to be. Question of identity here is meant to be brought to question. These are the very premises of the spiritual inquiry in terms of who am I? And even if the aforementioned teachers as Eckhart Tolle do not employ this, who am I? Of course, the very line of thought, the very root of where it meant to lead, comes from that. But what is identity? Before any one of us begins to disidentify with what we're supposed to disidentify with, do we question what is one's identity? Hence the question. So I'm asking you. Fine. There are fields of psychology going all the way back to the rise of psychology. Let us also bring this as a fitting reminder that the rise of psychology in the West at large is chiefly associated with a vacuum that began to be created in and among the groups of people where the outlived by then religious truth, the culture we were embedded for centuries, was no longer serving its purpose. Not that people somehow became disbelievers, but the religion no longer served that role, that purpose. Religion as an institution, as an institutionalized teachings of this or that, exponents that we know, let's say, here it's easy to speak about Christianity because that's the most widely spread religion, and the majority of us here in the room, majority of us, except with few exceptions, have deep roots in that, in your parents, in your grandparents, and so forth. But at some point, something happened, and that what was performed by, let's say, a role of a priest, where you go and through that mesh confess of your misgivings, was no longer there. Why? Because the educated, at least, began to open up the vistas of their inquiry into what was available at the time. We're speaking roughly end of the 19th century. Second half, end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, is a culmination of what was happening in terms of, and since the Industrial Revolution set in. It is at that time where the fracture began to happen a complete and utter fracture between a religious, spiritual connection and a so-called rising of the modern man or modern human. And that modern human was dissatisfied, educated, intelligent, insightful, well-read, soon well-traveled. Some at the time already did. Dipping themselves outside of the given tradition, allowing and having access. Come on, your own countrymen, if we are to speak of Germany as now here, where Immersion is being hosted, is known for his very, not just keen interest, that would be an understatement, in all things Indian and more so all things tantric. Carl Jung was known for cross-pollinating the field of psychology at its birthing still times with this what we talk about here. So the sense of identity was revisited, and going back to, let's say, the teachings of educators, those who were at the major reforms in education, people like Ouspensky, who have questioned the very system of education. The system of education, for example, this may be a revelation for some of you, as we know it, even today, certainly going back to the time of 100 years ago, was very much an outcome what was conceived some centuries earlier. The system of education was all based at trying to emulate what some of the largest institutions at the time, largest universities at the time, came up with. At the top of the hierarchy, the elites were fashioned all how these institutions and universities were conceived in Great Britain. Oxford and Cambridge became, not Cambridge, sorry, yes, Cambridge, yeah, Oxford and Cambridge. I thought I said Harvard, Cambridge. Harvard is the same. Harvard is just a complete carbon copy of how it was all conceived, which was very little to do with the development of individual. To speak in more kind of like blanket terms, it was a development of a functionary in a society. Functionary also in giving due to the echelons of the society one will belong, so one can swim along the fitting streams and fit well. So the education as we know it, even today, was really colored, not by bringing out the individual in everyone, something which will be questioned already by the very, very first, let's say, decades of the advancement of psychology in the West. And of course, people like Ouspensky, they did tremendous service to humanity, we could say. Most of you are not aware of that, but I, myself, is a kind of byproduct of a cross-pollinated system of education that the Soviet Union has adopted when it fractured itself deliberately and consciously from what was prior to that known and implemented into the system of education, because the so-called Soviets in the Soviet Union, after the revolution, when the time came to organize their affairs once they won the civil war, the major task was to how we're going to educate a new being, a new man, woman. of a different system. And guess what was adopted? Ouspensky's system was adopted. Because there had to be a radical departure from anything that was so-called capitalist society has to order. So whether this, and it's not that I'm just trying to say that, hey, look at me, like. What I'm saying is that, and I studied Ouspensky, of course. My first diploma was that of a teacher. When I graduated from the College of Art, after 4 years of graduation, I did my diploma precisely because we studied psychology and we studied Ouspensky's. So at the still quite tender age of 20, when I received my first diploma, we were already equipped with the basic understandings of how individuality is developed, what goes into, which are the crucial ages, phases of development, which was intimately interconnected with the psychophysiological development of the individual. So it wasn't just a kind of some abstract disciplines, it was all linked to the groups, ages. Why an 8-year-old differs from 12-year-old, and how the 12-year-old differs from 14, 16-year-old, because there are some really, really profound changes taking place. I'm making this a detour. You will connect the dots on your own, and I invite you to do that. Because when we speak of individual, when we speak of the process of identification, or indeed process of disidentification, as we are advised to undergo consciously when it comes to the spiritual work, at least if we are to take what spiritual teachers tell us, we need to understand first what went into the formation of the individual. What are we disidentifying with in the first place? Wouldn't that make sense? Because if someone tells you, oh, okay, fine, your name is this, okay, you consider yourself to be what? Brit, German, okay, gypsy, doesn't matter. Gender, okay, what? Race, this, that, tribe, all these are irrelevant veneer of who you are not. It's just something that conceals your true essence. To break it down, again, with all due respect, breaking it down without trying to mock it. I'm in this inquiry with you right now, revisiting this. I want to understand this again myself. What am I disidentifying with? What is identity? Therefore, I've asked you earlier what this identity is comprised of. How do you know you consider yourself this person? Because if the aforementioned, ET tells you that this is what you meant to disidentify with, because this is what covers you / robs you from the essence of who you are, then you ought to know, what am I disidentifying with? Am I disidentifying with my family history, with my upbringing, with my racial, national identities, with my gender? Because all this goes into that, what I consider myself. I don't need to remind myself that I'm a man. In the morning when I take a shower, oh, look, this little dinghy there. That means I'm still that. Okay, not transgender happen overnight. So, must be something remain continued and intact. Well, no, we don't. We don't. You don't walk around thinking I'm a woman. Or, okay, I don't want to be a woman, I want to be a man. although that wasn't invented. The transgender is only one way. The other way, it doesn't exist yet. Who knows? Genetic advancement, this and that, maybe it's constructible. The point is, what is identity? What it is comprised of? What went into, what material, what are the building blocks? I'm asking you this question, please don't wait for an answer. Don't wait for an answer. I haven't prepared answer. Nothing is what I'm speaking now is prepared. Because what I prepared upstairs, by the time I came down, I forgot it all. The plot is lost, need to be reconstructed. So therefore I'm like, okay, let's see what happens. So this identity, building blocks, what went into it? Yes, of course, I mean, there are also, has been dealt with a tremendous degree of insightfulness by various peers, not just peers in the field. Before that, it's a whole field. In psychology, this is why I said, if the examination of what goes into the growth of the psyche, hence the field of psychology, is made of how individual develops, what goes into development of individual. Obviously, it's a stagely process. Developmental phases, they are distinctive. We can identify this phase because that phase differs from the preceding phase. There is an interesting thing. Each phase conceals the preceding phase and becomes a thing in its own right. So therefore, if these phases were distinctively kind of like, okay, I was this person, and from the age of, let's say, 8.5 to 10.5, in this phase of 2 years, I distinctively had this detached idea of who I was to who I became, then maybe this would have been a piece of cake. But just as in everything, in all processes in nature, that fluffy little thing, velveteen to touch, as the budding almond to be, conceals the blossom of the tree entirely. And nothing tells us about that, how the tree was just maybe a couple of weeks ago in full blossom as a bride. And later on, when the summer heat and all that extremity of weather will crack that fluffy shell and makes it dry and reveal that fully developed nut, still concealed by a hard shell. In the same way, there is these developmental stages that conceal the preceding ones. So we have no idea really what went into that, what we consider ourselves to be, when we come to that moment in time when we realize for the very first time maybe what it actually pertains, what it means to be someone. For someone, maybe this happens very early on, that sense of individual identity could happen as early as 10, 12 or 14. Certainly this is the age when it begins to happen. The fall from grace, the fall from paradise that's what it is spoken of as. The loss of innocence. Those of you who are parents, observe that in your children. Those who have, or those of you who are too young, maybe observe that in greater detachment in your siblings, in your families, in your tribe. But it is so, it is there very clearly. So this, what we speak of, this, what goes into formation of identity, that sense of I. It's easy, though not easy at all, but it sounds so, to jump on that bandwagon very quickly that this I, it's all there is. Because the sense of I was there at all times. Never was the time when there was no sense of I. Never was the time. Of course, this becomes more fragmented for the aforementioned reasons just now, and we will return to this to examine to a greater degree why that actually is. But if any of us recall how we felt when we were at this phase of life, that phase of life, there was nothing that would tell us anything in terms of that what we're supposed to disidentify with, because the only true measure of the fact that we existed is this, that I was. That sense of experience of I amness did not diminish, no increase, no decreased. Just remember you running this little 4-year-old or 5-year-old. Just remember how it was. What were you up to? What were you doing? And I'm not saying what were you doing as if I'm interested in what you were doing, but what was it accompanied by? How do you know that this was you? How can you be sure that this experience was your experience? Because of that sense of I. And that sense of I did not undergo any change. None whatsoever. Whether your memory stretches as far back as the earliest memory, very few people have that capacity, because there's something to it that it wipes itself off. But some do have that, how they were, even as 2 or 3 years olds. Most of us have retained that very first moment when I do remember that, exactly that, not because my granny told me or my mommy told me, whoever, that how it was, because this is a trick where we simply project it onto our experience. But I'm speaking only on that, what you can recollect with complete and utter certainty. That at that very moment you remember that, your best buddy at the time was here, and the toy was there, and that, and this, and whatever. There was a birthday party, and the cake was cut, and you were crying, and someone was screaming, and whatever. Playing in a sand pit, being naughty, and, trying to pull your friend's panties down because you wanted to see what gender they are, and you're being told off, and whatever memories you have. There's nothing to be ashamed of. It's the age of innocence. I'm not talking about being 16 and pulling someone's pants down. That's different. This is that sense of I. The sense of I. When was it not? And you cannot give me one moment of any of that what you can recollect. And the only reason that there's any memory is because of that sense of I. You remember anything not because something happened, but because it happened to you. Is it not? How can you remember something that happened simply because it happened? It only happened as a result of your experience, unique experience to that, unique to you, to yourself. We need to tread very, very gently here. I advise myself, and just saying that we can't just quickly deal with this now. Lest we run the risk of completely missing the very, very precious meaning of that, what went into this so-called identity. Because it's too easy. To me, it feels too easy. There is already a bypass before one even can implement that what is being advised. Disidentify. Tell me your story. It's irrelevant. Disidentify with that. It's all nonsense. It didn't happen. It's an illusion. Don't you see that? Good. How do you feel now? Freedom? Fantastic. You've done your job. Next. Tell me your name. That's not your name. We're going to rename you. Next. So what happened? No, it didn't happen. You tell yourself that happened. Okay? What about you? You see, it's easy to mock, but that's not the invitation. The invitation is to go deep into the essence of inquiry. What is identity? What it is comprised of? And if you really go into it, I'm afraid we cannot put our finger on what we are advised to disidentify with. It's all just spiritual talk. It's talking. It's doing something. It's like making use of language, hoping it's going to deliver. At best. At worst, it's creating a possibility, a predisposition for undesirable sense of dissociation, undesirable sense of and in all this now, I leave the dots, you add. It begins there. Because when we are advised to disidentify, and then we are given also a guilty trip on what we identified with, and therefore what a sorrowful situation arose here. And it is all because you erroneously consider yourself to be. The core question here is not that, what's simply being held there around the central axis of the I, and I only. That I is the singularity of everything that we experience. That I is where everything is primarily stems from. And not that it all gets back reabsorbed into, but that's the only measure of something that we can say, that happened to me. Therefore, I have this sense of identity. And now, again, going back to the fields of psychology. Psychology's noble attempt is to reconcile this otherwise irreconcilable paradox, which results in almost impossible task of growing up as a soul. The field of psychology, in fact, is not about how to heal someone and put them into a status quo. I think this is doing disservice to what psychology really is about. Therefore, the father of psychology already was wrong from the moment he came up with the very, very premises upon which psychology and many of its schools were built upon. So we are grateful and indebted to beings like Carl Jung for the audacity to criticize his mentor, Sigmund Freud, for showing holes and limitations of that approach. So that invitation to disidentify leads to, or should ideally lead to, the questioning of identity itself. What is being here held as a culprit? Identity. What went into that identity? What could possibly eclipse? Or if this is a natural process of the maturation of the soul, to have greater sense of one's individual self. What do we do with that? Do we actually reach that sense of psychological maturity, or walk around forever in our tender teens? Do we ever become these grown-up beings? So I'm throwing it just out there, just as a footnote, but I'm throwing it out there. The whole, no matter how amazingly promising these propositions, for some they were built into spiritual strategies, that all this is down to disidentifying, just because there is this mechanism of ego. And if you crush the ego, dismantle the ego, break the ego, kill the ego, then somehow one is set free. But how can that be possible if perhaps something much more intricate goes into this formation? Much more intricate. What if the process of psychological maturity is a prerequisite in terms of full development of human psyche, all the way to this spontaneous realization of who am I, without which an invitation is always to bypass even because it feels like that's the surest, quickest and most direct way. Since I'm bringing it out into the open, and also because it is a continued field of inquiry for myself as far as this job is concerned. I don't have ready-made answers. I'm inviting you into a joint field of inquiry because I don't know. I don't know what happens in any one of you. Deep at the level of your experience, it is opaque and not known to me. And I will have no reservations about not wanting to know. Because really that's not important at some point. And because also I went through a phase, the phase of psychic gifts, where this was granted, and it was not a pleasant experience. I never wanted to develop it further. I worked with it. I had to face it and deal with it. And the amount of information that was unleashed and released could have easily made me into a very different jobs today, occupying a very different profession. All I can speak of with certainty is my own experience. From that point, I can speak with certainty that it allows. And therefore, I can only say to you that you can only truly hang your coat on that which is truly yours, as an analogy. You can only trust your own experience. You can only truly find answers in your own field and nowhere else. No one will ever give you the answer. One will give you more or less profound response, more or less mysterious, more or less amazing, more or less what have you, but it will never be a fully satisfying one unless you will discover it in your own self. This is a sign of psychological maturity. Only in the psychologically mature, this rises. This rises on its own. And of course, not that you are completely pushed into the depth without knowing how to swim and gasping for dear life in deep, dark waters of consciousness, as sometimes they do teach how to swim. But there is something to it. The analogy is there, if we are to be candid about it here. Nobody is going to constantly give you that, throw you that, whatever that, safety, right? Jacket and or ring or pretend somewhere in the shallow end of the pool. Okay, let's close our eyes, deep in, and imagine you're drowning. What are you going to do now, dear? Swim. You're doing well, yes, oh, so nice. Lovely. Oh, beautiful. Sweetie. I'm just a father of small children still, so it's not like that. Not quite like that. So therefore, the question of identity is a very, very profound one, and not to be just given that quick, yes, of course, why should I identify with this and that? And yet, paradoxically, all that, what went into the making here, is serving somehow, because this is a very, very important revelation as well. All this, because each and every one of us is only, and always to the degree to which you are right at this very given moment. Everything else is a speculation. You are as you are at this very given moment. But you are as you are in this very given moment because of what happened to you. Every bit, every little big or small bit that went into this is what brought you here. Brought you here into where you are. So this disidentification needs to be very attentively re-examined. Because yes, there is an importance of that, what we identify with. Because what we identify with is what makes us who we are. So therefore, working with identity here, from the point of view of this particular, let's say, tradition which is used as a cloak to wrap, as an umbrella, has a very distinctive feature, a perspective. This is what the deep, dim, secret meaning of the term immersion. There's a Sanskrit term that gave that inspiration. It's called samavesha. Samavesha. being claimed by, immersed into. And that is being claimed into the field of who you are, either through a sweeping motion of the direct path, the so-called pathless path, by identifying with awareness, identifying with Shiva, consciously identifying with Shiva, consciously taking the turn here to identify yourself with the greatest, with the utmost, not settling for anything shorter than. This is why it's called the highest path.